Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Judge Bruce Schroeder, the longest-serving circuit court judge in the state. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome I feel very welcome. You've been very kind.
Okay. When did you come to Kenosha?
1971. Actually, it was January 12th, 1971. And I remember the date well, not just because it was my first job as an attorney, but also because I met my wife that very same day at the Kenosha courthouse.
And how did that take place?
The district attorney who hired me, I was hired as an assistant district attorney. Burton Scott, who ended up on the Court of Appeals, he was taking me around to meet the important personages around the courthouse. And my 97-pound wife, who was 5'2", was in a red jumpsuit, I remember exactly, and I met her, and I guess it must have been about 17 months later, I married her at St. James's Church, just a few blocks from the courthouse.
Okay. And so where did you go to school, and how did you come to be hired as an assistant district attorney?
I grew up on the east side of Milwaukee, over east of UWM, while you were going to school. Well, maybe not then, but I attended schools in Milwaukee, went to Marquette University, and also Marquette Law School. Graduated from the law school in December of 70, and was admitted to the bar January 7th of 71. And applied for jobs, and the most attractive and the one I was hired onto was an assistant district attorney to Judge Scott, and been here ever since.
When did you become interested in the law?
A long time ago, and I never watched the lawyer shows on TV. I watched the police shows, but not the lawyer shows. But my mother had a desire that I be an attorney, and she also wanted me to be a priest, and she wanted me to do both, and I couldn't handle that much. But I did not. I actually started college with the idea of becoming a history professor at the college level. Well, journalist actually first. That was short-lived, and then I decided to head for a university level teaching of history, and then ultimately in my last year decided, well, maybe Mom's right, and I'll give law school a try. And
was there anyone else in your family who had gone to law school?
my dad had attended Marquette as well, and he never practiced law, and he went into private business, and he was a sales manager, and so he was a people person, I'd say. He was out with the public doing quite a bit, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the law from him. I learned a lot. I had just a wonderful opportunity to grow up in a wonderful city, Milwaukee, and in a wonderful family.
Okay. What did you do during the summers to make money to stay in law school or Marquette University?
Okay. And I can tell you Marquette was a lot cheaper then than it is now. But in fact, I think my first year of law school, I think the tuition was $1,300. And it probably costs about 50 times that much now. And during the summers, I worked for the Whitefish Bay Police Department. and I patrolled the beaches in Whitefish Bay, which is, I think it's about 3.6 miles. Most of it's sand, but there were some times when I had to get into the mud and walk in the water sometimes, and sometimes on high sea walls. But it was a wonderful experience, and I actually I would never have been physically fit for it, but I would actually like to have gone into police work, but ultimately ended up in the DA's office, which I guess is as close as you can get.
Okay. And you had many mentors early on in your career once you became an assistant district attorney here?
I did. I had a couple of fellows, in addition to Judge Scott, who was just a wonderful employer, and I learned a lot from him. And then in doing trial work, I was broken in by an attorney who's passed away now by the name of Myron Keyes. He was very helpful. He was the first assistant DA. I was educated by, or I should say, I was working with people whom I had gone to school with, one of whom was Tom Anderson. I didn't really have too much to do with him. I had a few cases. He was doing some defense work, and he ended up doing a lot of divorce work. That was the senior Tom Anderson. And I had gone to school with him. And being from Milwaukee, and at that time there had been some high-profile incidents in Kenosha, and a lot of the people in Milwaukee thought, oh, Kenosha's got a lot of crime down there. And Tommy Anderson would show up for law school every day with a black shirt and a white tie and a black jacket. And he fit the profile that a lot of people from Milwaukee had, although there was a lot of mob activity up there too. But and then my very, very dear friend Mario Ventura, who just passed away in the last couple of months, and he worked with me in the DA's office. He was a year behind me in law school, but I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot about living from him. I learned about at his funeral, I thought, and he was not I don't want to give the wrong impression. I was going to say he wasn't a particularly religious person, but that's not true. I mean, he was a regular church attendee and a religious guy. But I said at his funeral, he brought me closer to God. Just a friend whom I truly loved, and he. We enjoyed our time together in law school, and then worked together in the DA's office. And then he ultimately returned to his dad's business, the Mars Cheese Castle, out on the interstate. And I learned a lot from him. And of course I learned from everybody who gave me a thrashing in court. You learn a lot more when you're a lawyer. You learn a lot more from losing than you do from winning.
How long were you an assistant district attorney?
I was assistant DA for about a year and a half, and then I had the good fortune of being acquainted with a man who was ultimately to become a circuit judge, also John Malloy, and who was later married to Judge Wagner. When he was very influential in public affairs and Democratic Party affairs, and for whatever reason he took a liking to me. And when Judge Scott, when District Attorney Scott became, when there was a vacancy when Judge Urban Zeevers retired, Burton Scott was appointed as judge, so to replace him as district attorney, he and a lot of other wonderful people who barely knew me, most of them, recommended me for appointment as district attorney. And so I was very fortunate, and I was the youngest. I'm now the longest serving judge in the state. Well, at that time I was the youngest DA in the state, and I was 26 and newly married. And I was an assistant DA for about a year and a half, and DA for about 4.5 years.
So this was an appointment to a district attorney, and then there was a term that you ran for?
Exactly. The
and
DA's
won.
term at the time was 2 years, and so I was appointed in August, and I had to run to retain that position in the November election, and the Republican candidate was a man whom I deeply admire, and is also a retired judge. It sounds like kind of almost like a clique, but Robert Baker, who was from an old established legal family in Kenosha, and he, even though we were opponents, he and I have been good friends ever since. He was just wonderful. He's been a wonderful friend. He recommended me when the judgeship came open. He recommended me for appointment. Senator John Maurer was influential, and I had run for the state senate. He and I were contestants for that, and he gave me a beating. But he was wonderful to me, and I had the good fortune that I ended up being close friends with the people whom I had been combatant with.
Okay, and what year were you appointed judge?
1972, and I served in.
Serving judge?
Oh, I'm sorry, judge. Excuse me. I was thinking back of being DA again. Appointed judge in 1983 after leaving the DA's office after a total of about 6 years. 6.5 years. I went into private practice with my friend Mario Ventura, and I truly enjoyed our time together. Of all my jobs I've had, and I've enjoyed every one of them. The time I spent in partnership with Mario was the most fun. And he was just such a terrific partner. And then when Judge Malloy passed away, I was appointed judge and have been ever since. I was judicial appointments, or if there's a vacancy in office, judicial appointments last for the until the next judicial election. So I was appointed in May of '83, and I had to stand for election in the spring election of '84. 6-year term, and have been reelected since. And I'm pretty sure I'm on my last.
Your last term?
I'm elected till I'm 80. So maybe
you will be
give
80
somebody
when the
else a
term.
chance. I'll probably be 79 when the term ends.
Okay.
But I think if I weren't intending to resign, my dear wife would reinstruct me.
Okay, so what qualities do you
Or
think?
I shouldn't say resign. I should say fill out, end up with that as my last term.
Okay. Sorry. So, what qualities do you think a judge has to have in order to be successful?
Well, there's a number of them, and when we spoke the other day, I mentioned wisdom as the first one, which is also when I applied for the position, I put that as number one, and I got away with it because I got the appointment. But you pointed out, wisdom comes with age, and I was 37 at the time, and you're quite right. And it is remarkable the amount, particularly in the judicial field, but in a lot of fields, of course, but in the judicial field, experience means an awful lot. You've been there before on so many things, and particularly when you're trying a lot of cases, and I've always tried large numbers of cases. I enjoy trials. I don't try to twist people's arm to get them to settle because, well, I just philosophically don't really like to do that. I don't like to do that, and I enjoy the combat of the trial and refereeing and trying to be fair, but certainly being fair to both sides, keeping an open mind. That's probably the hardest thing to learn is not to make up your mind the minute you sit down, and unfortunately, you see that happen sometimes. But it is both something that you have to force yourself to do, and it's something that gets easier with time.
How about being healthy?
Healthy, as one of Judge Urban Sievers, when we discussed the fact that I was going to apply for the judgeship, was talking about the qualities that I would have that would help me, and he said, "And you're healthy." And I thought it was kind of an odd comment to make, but as I realized, it's a demanding job, and you can't be missing a lot of work. And I've been blessed in that respect until last year when I had a little fall. But I never took a sick day until last year. I'd take a vacation day here and there when I had the sniffles or COVID. But he was absolutely correct. You need to be on your toes all the time, and you don't get a chance to kind of slough off here and there.
So do you think when you were appointed both to the district attorney and then appointed to circuit judge, do you think you had enough experience, considering how quickly you went from assistant DA to DA, and then all of a sudden they needed a judge and you were appointed to that?
Well, with the judgeship, I definitely feel I did, because I had been in the DA's office and I tried a lot of cases. Some DAs prefer the administrative side of the office, and there are DAs and names you've heard, people you've seen on TV who are DAs in really big counties and that, and what they're doing is all administrative, running the operation, which is sometimes a full-time job. It wasn't in Kenosha at that time, but it's a handful, and the hiring process, and then you can do a lot of trial work. And in a county the size of Kenosha, I had the good fortune that I was able to try almost all the biggest cases, and so I had a lot of trial experience, which when you're ultimately going to a job that involves rulings on evidence, knowing the evidence and the way it works is critical. And I had civil work. I had done divorce work. I had done estate work. I had done civil cases. So I didn't do bankruptcy, but that's a federal court matter anyway. So yes, I do think I had the experience for that. DA, I'm sure there were a lot of raised eyebrows. It worked out well for me, but I can't tell you that it never happened that I thought, oh, wow, what did I get into here? But you just keep plugging away and do your job, and it worked out all right. And I was very fortunate, the caliber of the people who worked with me. I mentioned Mario already, but I had a number of fantastic assistant DAs who I sometimes made the statement in my last year in office, I could stay home every day and this place would run like a charm. I never did that, and I was never tempted to do that, but I had really wonderful people with me.
Okay, how would you describe the way you manage a courtroom or preside in the courtroom? What is your method of operation?
Well, I have to tell you, I tried a case a couple of years ago that has given me a lot of reading material. Different perceptions people had about my abilities, my personality, the way I tried cases. And I was just talking to somebody at a party yesterday, and he was commenting on my handling of the particular case. And I mentioned him. I said, I could tell you, I've got millions of people all over the world who don't agree with you, who think I did a really terrible job. And they put it in writing so I can, if I wanted to right now, I could haul it up on the internet and this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He's too old. He's biased and this, that, and the other thing. And I said, and I could bring up a million on the other side. So I've got something besides my own opinions. But I think I have a reputation for. I've read so many times about being a no-nonsense judge, and I take that as somebody who doesn't want to mess around with petty stuff that people are just trying to. Well, the old expression from English barristers and the judges, pull the wool over the judge's eyes, and I think people think that I don't want to mess around with that kind of thing. I am first and foremost. I want everything to be fair, and you have to sometimes be pretty direct with people to make sure they don't deviate from that, and even unintentionally, which can happen.
How about rules of evidence? Do you have a certain view? There are some rules I'm not crazy about, but in terms of the rules, I think these are the product of hundreds of years of experience, both in our courts and in the courts of England before, and they're really quite remarkable in leading the jury or the judge to a fair result, which is ultimately the key, is make sure everything's fair. And I try to adhere rigorously, but there is a good deal of discretion with some of the rules. How about certain types of evidence being presented or trying to be presented? What do you have any opinion on those types of things? The
most litigated area in the law of evidence is what are called other crimes, wrongs, and acts. And it has been. When I was in law school, I was interviewed by one of the justices on the Supreme Court for a clerkship, and I brought up areas that I was particularly interested in, and I mentioned other crimes, wrongs, and acts. He said, that's our number one area where we make our decisions. And now it's 50 years later, and that's still true. And some judges have a very elastic, and I'm in no way am I criticizing. It's a philosophical thing. It involves your own experiences, not the personal experiences, but your prior cases. And they're pretty receptive to evidence where someone is accused, for example, of being involved in an assault is the area where you see a lot of it, and is accused in a particular case of alleged assault, and the prosecutor will want to bring in a prior incident in which there was also an accusation of an assault. And there's where the rules get tightest, because there's no two cases seem exactly the same. And that's where I tend to admit the evidence, is when they're similar. That's actually the basis of the rule, is where somebody does something really bizarre. The classic case is a guy who was looking for child victims, and he asked some little children if he would help them find a black and white rabbit that was running around. And he induced the children to help him, and then it ended up in a criminal act. That's that kind of thing you wouldn't see very often. Very few cases would come through. There would be an accusation that the guy tried to solicit the children by asking for help to find a black and white rabbit. Well, it turns out when the man had a prior episode like that, where he had assaulted the child, that becomes very, very probative and relevant evidence, as to whether he committed this one. It, as one of the legal writers wrote, it bears the signature of the accused. So that is an area where experience with the rules of evidence and applying them, different judges look at it different. Some are, as I say, quite expansive in what they'll admit, and I have a reputation for being a little more tight-fisted in terms of what I'll admit.
So if a prior case has no bearing on the current case, you would do what?
Not let it in.
Not let that in.
Mm-hmm. And that was, I told myself I wasn't going to talk about a particular case, but I already made one reference to it a couple of years ago. And it's the notorious Rittenhouse case. And there was enormous amount of thought on both sides because there had been a prior episode involving Mr. Rittenhouse that did not involve his actually having or using a gun, but making some remarks of a bellicose nature. And I decided it was not sufficiently similar to be admitted. And there were a lot of people, many TV commentators, who said, oh, that should have come in. So, as I say, the judge does have a lot of discretion, and for a reason.
Are there situations where the judge's discretion is limited or too restrictive, you think?
Well, I guess over the years I've felt that there are some areas where the exact same rule. People accused of driving under the influence, 8th offense. And my feeling has always been, oh, that should be admissible, that he's had all these priors. Because in terms of probability, which is what evidence is all about, probability, this individual is far more likely to be comfortable with driving his automobile after he's had too much to drink than the average person. So while I understand why on a charge of a second offense you wouldn't automatically let in the first offense, when you're getting into those kind of numbers, I think it has a lot of probative value. And if they propose today to change the law and allow that to be admitted, I would favor that. That happened a few years with sex offenses, where they've allowed a lot of stuff which formerly was excluded is now statutorily admissible. So they took the power away from the judges, or at least limited it so that more of that type of evidence would come out, because the legislature felt that it was very probative.
Okay. Do you look at a law passed by the legislature as what they intended to do, or by the wording that was put in the law?
That's actually the first rule of statutory interpretation, is the plain meaning of the language. That can be a head scratcher when they pass conflicting laws, which they do periodically, when there's when there's a control change in the legislature, or when there are good ideas come from all quarters. Some person comes in and he's advocating for liquor licenses to be expanded or something, and the next person comes in and is concerned about the amount of liquor that's being sold. You listen to them, and they both made very good points. So it must be tough to be a legislature and have to pick. But so occasionally the statutes will end up enacted on 2 different days, and they really are tough to sort out. But as a general statement, it's remarkably clear, actually, what they state, and how good the English is, I might add. Very seldom do you find errors of our language in the statutes, so they do a great job. But they're usually fairly easy to work with, and Chief Justice Roberts had his confirmation hearing. They were discussing agreement or disagreement with what the ruling is. And he said, a judge who hasn't gone home just disgusted with what he's done during the day once in a while hasn't been a judge very long, because that's the truth. I get statutes and I think, you've got to be kidding me. But that's not my job. That's for the legislature, and that's the glory of being a free people.
And what about the discretion of a judge in passing a sentence? Are things out there that make it difficult for a judge to administer, or whatever it is, for a sentence to a person who's been convicted?
Yep. Sentencing is always a tough job. It's sometimes tougher than others. I've certainly imposed sentences that I wish I didn't have to. And I've also had people walk away and worried that maybe I'd under-sentenced. But there are restrictions on us from a wide variety of sources, and both in the sense that the legislature in a few areas has created minimum sentences, which, if they're used judiciously, I mean, for years the penalty for what was formerly known as second-degree murder said not less than 5 nor more than 25 years. And we didn't get a lot of second-degree murder convictions, but I never saw one that I thought, oh, that's got to be a big problem for the judge. I don't think I ever sentenced anyone under that law, but when I was DA, I never thought, oh, that's a tough one. On the other hand, occasionally, and it goes in spurts, they decide we've got to crack down more on this or on that, or less, and they will start passing minimum sentences. And the best example I can think of, although there are others, is on child pornography. When nobody's sympathetic. Well, I don't want to say nobody, but very few people are sympathetic to that. But they have minimums in there that can actually make it harder for the judge to have long-term control. I'm a control freak, and I like to have control over people for as long as possible when they're engaged in that kind of conduct. I don't want to give them a statutory minimum sentence and then have them off supervision in a very short period of time, and then they're back on the street with absolutely no control over them. But they pass minimum sentences for child pornography. But by and large, there are not minimum sentences for sexual assault of children. And I've never been able to quite figure that out because, as I say, sometimes those minimum sentences can prevent what I do as a control freak, is I oftentimes will send somebody to prison for a period of time, and he's a first offender and otherwise an upright citizen, but he's got to go to prison for what he did, and because the legislature wants that done. But when they impose, for example, a minimum 3-year sentence, and the DA comes in with 10 counts, then I have to make a decision. And I feel I'm in a straitjacket, because if the 3-year sentence is an appropriate one, unless I put him on probation on the other 10 or on concurrent sentences, which is even worse, because I'll lose any degree of control I would have over him after a short period of time. Instead of having a lot of consecutive sentences, so that he'll really never be restored to complete freedom from risk. He won't be at risk of getting massive consecutive sentences, which could remain for the rest of his life.
Okay, so if you have multiple counts on the same charge or conviction, if you have to sentence the minimum on each of those counts, it adds up
Yes.
to a lot.
If you do
Or-
sentence, if you sentence, then you did it much better than I did explaining how it works. If you impose any sentence at all, you have to impose at least 3 years. If you impose them concurrently, then you could have 50 counts and they end up as 3 years. If you impose them consecutively, there has to be at least 3 years on each one. And if I gave somebody 150 years on looking at 50 photographs in a same session, I would expect that there'd be an appeal based on an over sentence. Whereas if I can put them on, sentence him for 3 and maybe another 3, so 6 years, and he'll stay in prison for 6 years, and then put him on consecutive probation for 20 or 25 years, then I feel much more comfortable that he's not going to walk away. I hate to use the expression, but as a free man at the end of it.
Okay, what do you think, and maybe you think it's changed over time, your reputation as a judge?
I came on and I was I spent many quarters over the years being the most substituted judge in the state. And one of the problems I've had with the substitution law is it really doesn't tell the judge how she's doing or how he's doing. It may be because people view the judge as too harsh, or maybe not fair, that's not so good. Although what they think and what the true fact of it is are two different things. It really doesn't communicate much for the judge to work with, to think about where she can make positive changes. But I spent many quarters where I was the most substituted judge in the state. As the years have passed, for some reason, I've now come to be viewed as pro-defense. I read that on the New York Times, and I read that in the Chicago Tribune and the Los Angeles Times, and I'm thinking, what? But I think it's a combination, and I think some of the lawyers who were interviewed at the time of the Rittenhouse trial said, well, for trial, he's fine because I am more restrictive as to what the prosecution can offer. But if you get found guilty, it can be really ugly. And I actually have a letter that I got from a prisoner quite a few years ago. And I keep it under the glass on my desk. Number one, because I enjoyed it, and number two, it just says how people do perceive things. It's from a defendant whom I had sentenced to prison, and he's writing me and he's telling me, "Can I come back in front of you?" Some other judge has already sentenced him. He said, "Can I come back in front of you? I wanted to have you as my judge, but my lawyer told me that would be a big mistake because you're too tough." And I think, okay. But everybody's got a different view. And some people, I'm sure in 40 years, some people think I wasn't fair in their cases, or I'm not fair in cases generally. So I guess that's why the legislature has passed this. But how I was viewed coming in, I definitely was viewed as pro-prosecution. I think nowadays the view is a little more mixed and is generally more, not pro-defense, but more open-minded on evidence, but not depending on the nature of the crime.
Okay. Looking back on the Rittenhouse trial, how do you think you handled that case as the presiding judge?
Going into the case, I had 4 things I wanted to do. We had the rioting. People, I happened to be watching it, it was on TV for some other purpose a couple of weeks ago. I was watching these people. And of course the protests were largely, as was being stated, nonviolent and well within the rights that people had to protest what they thought was lawless behavior by the police. But watching the people, they erected the steel barricades around the courthouse building. And these charges that were coming, charge after charge, these people were trying to knock those walls down to get at the building, to get at the citadel of justice. And in fact, I had 2 holes into my windows in my courtroom. One, they told me looked like a stone or something, and the other one they told me was a bullet hole. So this was a rough situation for this community, and people were afraid. And so I had 4 things that I wanted to do. I wanted, number 1, a fair trial. Number 2, I didn't want to have a mistrial because we'd have to start over from scratch. Number 3, I didn't want a hung jury because we'd have to start over from scratch. And I didn't want a riot. And I got all my wishes. So I'll never make the claim. Well, I'm sure I would, but to my wife or whatever. But to say, I think I handled that really, really well. I'll just say I got where I wanted to go, and I don't ever comment on jury verdicts. The only person I've ever discussed that verdict with is my wife, and she'll never tell. And but I thought that Kenosha can be proud of the people who were on that jury. They were dealing with a case that was the political focus of the country. Somebody referred to it on TV the other day as the trial of the century. I don't know about that, but it was certainly, somebody told me from Court TV the other day that at the peak of the trial, just on that one network, they had 5 million viewers. And so the eyes of the country were on Kenosha and on the trial. And that jury came in, we picked them in record time, and I don't mean we just rushed through it, but we picked them in really rapid time. I had figured it would take a day and a half, but if we got lucky, we'd pick them in a day, and we did it in a day. We were there till 7 or so, and then they, I don't recall the exact length. I think it was 14 or 16 days, and while they deliberated, and during some aspects of the trial, there were protesters both ways on the steps of the courthouse. And I originally had wanted to seal off the park and not have it open. But the sheriff's office said, we're not going to do that. And I think, I'm not just people saying no, but they didn't seal off the park, and actually people then were congregating on the very doorway of the courthouse, and from both sides, including a guy who actually brought a loaded rifle. And the police asked him, would you mind going home? And he did. And they were chanting various chants, and on the first day of the deliberations, they came in, the sheriff's office came in and said, do you want us to clear them out of there? And I said, no, that might just cause more problems. And they're not causing any big problems right now, except they're making all this racket, and the juries could get distracted. So I said to the bailiff, go up and see if the jury would like to move to another part of the building where they wouldn't be exposed to that. And they came back with a message. No, they were drowning each other out with their discussions of the case, but they were not troubled at all. So that courageous jury was up there in deliberation. I think it was three days, and they, as they say, everything came true perfectly. So, I, not commenting on the verdict, I was delighted with the outcome, and the credit goes to the jury.
Okay, how important is research to a judge? I mean, a judge doesn't know the law and all aspects of it when someone either in the process of a trial taking place or steps in between, or somebody a lawyer makes some kind of motion or something, and you have to say, wait, I have to check this out.
Yep.
How much time is spent doing that?
Yeah, not too often. And it depends on your assignment too and how familiar you are with it. And when I came in, I had quite a bit of criminal law experience. So, and that was my first stop, was in the felony court. So I didn't have to do that too often because I had so much experience in trying cases. But it does happen. And that's something else a new judge has to learn, is you can't be embarrassed about stopping and admitting you don't know the answer, and you have to look it up.
And how long can that take?
Oh, sometimes months. Literally, not in the middle of a trial, but there's motions on my desk back at the office right now for trials that are coming up in the next few weeks, and some of the problems are pretty knotty, and I have to resolve those to the best of my ability. And well, I like to think, even if I just flipped a coin, there would be a 50% chance I'd be right. But it isn't that easy, and it actually can be an enjoyable part of the job, is finding the answer, or what you feel is the answer, and it can take. We actually had one issue involving the possession of the firearm in the Rittenhouse case that I had to do a lot of research on that one, because the statute is very strangely worded, and I'm not being critical, but some of the legal commentators on television were talking about how difficult that statute was, and I ultimately found what I thought was the correct answer. But it happens. Usually doesn't take too long. But I've sent juries away for a day while I work on some of these legal issues and hear arguments from the lawyers. And in the midst of hours of argument, suddenly somebody comes up with a gem. Makes it all easy.
How about research as far as new laws, procedural changes? How much of that involves a judge's time?
A lot. They do wholesale revisions, which they do periodically, and are talking about some that they are talking about doing now, are easier because they clean everything up and get rid of some of the stuff that really doesn't make much sense or is difficult to apply. And they come out with a nice new code that's generally pretty easy to understand. We're going to have a huge amount of change in the law of evidence on the hearsay rule. England has been moving away from the traditional hearsay rule for quite a number of years, and in civil cases it's practically vanished. And I'm not even going to attempt to get into describing hearsay here today, because it would take us hours. But and I think that'll be a helpful revision. They will periodically revise certain aspects of the criminal code, the probate code, the domestic relations, juveniles, divorces, and the civil rules. And some of them are tough to adjust to, and when we've been around as long as I have, in fact, I've got an issue that I'm not going to get into deeply, but I've got an issue right now that involves interpretations of some court rulings and words that have actually changed in their meaning in the 50 years I've been practicing. What the word, we can go to dictionaries more than you might think, and to see what the word means. And some dictionaries are pretty quick to make adjustments to, I'll call it newspeak, and some are very hidebound and they don't want to make changes too soon. So I've got a statement was made in a decision by the Court of Appeals, which involved a different statement that was made by another trial judge. And now it's in my hands because it rebounded from the Court of Appeals where that judge was reversed, and now I have to apply the new language, which is what the Court of Appeals used, versus the old language that the trial judge used and that I am more comfortable with. And it's makes you want to get up in the morning and go to work.
Okay, what do you see as the best part of your job that you accomplish?
I tell people sometimes, like everybody else, carpenters break the law sometimes. And when I have one of them in, or somebody who's in the building trades generally, I said, I envy your job, because at the end of the day, you get to look at what you built. And in my job, not always. Sometimes I feel great too. Well, I always feel great, really. But I mean, I feel better at the end of the day sometimes, because I feel something constructive has happened. And but sometimes my job is destructive. And instead of being able to look at what I built, I sent this guy to prison for 20 years. And that's going to affect his family and his friends and his job. And so it's a destructive role. And a few years back, one of my neighbors, who happened to be a pain management physician, was talking about his job, and he says, I've got the best job there is, because I relieve people's pain, and they pay me to do it. He says, how can you get a better job than that? So I reflected on my job, and I think, holy smokes, sometimes we are civilized in our society that we don't let roving gangs administer justice. At least we try to prevent that. And so we select people based on experience and learning and the like to do our punishing for us. Or sometimes to not do the punishing, but there's just 250 judges in the state who are empowered to imprison people. And so sometimes my role is getting paid to do the harm that the community wants inflicted. Not because we want to hurt people, but because we want to send messages about what's acceptable behavior and what isn't.
So how do you view the judge's role in society?
Well, hopefully we will do what the founders of our country wanted us to do. I lament the fact that it doesn't seem that they're putting as much emphasis on civics in the grade schools and history in the high schools and even in the university level. And I'm not talking about history. One of the shortcomings of history when I was in school was we didn't learn anything about African history or Far Eastern history. We learned basically American and Western civilization with some Mexican. But, and there's been a reaction to that, and they've stressed some of those areas, which is good. But our law is rooted in Western civilization, and particularly in England. And if people don't have an awareness of what things were like at the time of our revolution, they're liable to step away from some of the concepts that we treasure, like trial by jury. There's constant pressure from certain groups to reduce the availability of trial by jury, resolution of issues by jury trial. That was deliberately, this is what I tell juries. Juries, when I give them their instructions, you were selected to protect people from me. Not just me, but every judge, because every judge was viewed with fear by the founders of our country. They were appointed by the king, they were paid by the king, and so they were dependent on the king. And the same thing is true of the right of a speedy trial, because the king would throw people in the tower and just leave them there till the king had a strong enough case to take to court. Until the trial of William Penn, I'm going to say, I'll have the year wrong, 1600s, late I think, the judge could actually tell the jury how to decide a criminal case. And only because of courageous jurors who stood up to the judge was the principle established. The judge cannot instruct or overrule a jury in a criminal case to find a verdict a certain way. If people don't understand the importance of those rights to the founders of our country, they'll give them up easily. And they protect every one of us. I'm amazed in the intention that we have in this country today, that you can swap your channel from one channel to another, and people are saying really far out stuff, and they're able to do it because we live in the United States and our Constitution.
So when you leave work every day and go home, do you leave the job in the office? You take it with you?
I don't lose sleep about things I've done or things I have to do. I've been blessed with good sleep habits, but yes, I do think about, and usually, almost every day I take work home. And I don't want to sound like I'm knocking myself out, because number one, it's enjoyable. A lot of what I do, cases all have little differences. But also, some of my colleagues start at 8:30 in the morning. I don't start till 9. So I owe a half an hour back right there. So I have to do that at home to make up for it. But I leave each day, I think, generally with a sense of satisfaction. And I've been blessed with a wife who's, well, I met her at the courthouse, so she's familiar with a lot of what goes on. She's very patient with me. And I think I'm one of the luckiest guys on earth.
What's next after your term is up?
I like to read, usually essays. I've never been a good reader. I did read almost all of the classics. There were some, never could read Moby Dick, but tried many times. But I've read most of the classics, but I prefer essay writing. It's easier. and people get to the point more faster. But I have materials that Judge Wagner suggested years ago, about a 5-minute essay that comes to me every morning, and that starts my day. And then from there I start researching the things I read in the article, and a lot of them are about history, but some of them are about the sewage system that was devised in London in 1735, and I somehow find interest in that too, and bugs and everything. So I'll do a lot of that. I'm kind of a newsy news hound, so I try to watch a lot of the news programs, and I try to spread it around so I'm watching different points of view. And I love the Milwaukee Brewers. And the Packers and Marquette basketball, but Brewers are right. So I'm sure there's a lot of that in my future. So
Well, thank you very much for talking with me today.
thank you for being kind enough to put up with me, and it's been a pleasure. And I wish you the very best. And
You as well.
this is a great project you've got going. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of it.